Written in the Stars. Episode 3. The Isolation of a Broken Soul.
It had been days. Days of silence, days of distance, and most painfully, days of a love that seemed to unravel with every passing second. The very active and bright Taehyun had become a shadow of himself. His room, once a place of warmth and laughter, had transformed into a silent sanctuary of pain. The door was always shut, his world confined to the four walls that no longer felt like home. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He barely moved. His once bright eyes were dim, haunted by the weight of the misunderstandings, and the loneliness that gnawed at him like a hungry beast. His mother, Mrs. Kong, would come to his room often, her soft knocks at the door followed by gentle calls of his name. Taehyun, sweetheart, please eat something. You've barely touched your meals. But there was never any reply. His silence cut deeper than any words could. Even his mother, the woman who had always been the one to comfort him, couldn't break through the walls he had built around himself. One evening, Mrs. Kong, with a basket of freshly prepared food in her hands, knocked gently on Taehyun's door. Taehyun, she called softly, her voice thick with worry, you haven't eaten for days. Just a little, darling, please. She waited in silence, but no sound came from within. Her heart ached, her motherly instincts telling her that something deeper than just a broken heart was troubling her son. She had always known him as someone who wore his heart on his sleeve, and now, he had locked it away. Her hands trembled as she placed the basket of food by the door and walked away, her heart heavy with sorrow. Taehyun's pain was now her pain, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach him. The next morning, Nia could feel the change in the air. Taehyun hadn't come out of his room the entire day before, and today was no different. His absence hung heavily in the house, as though the light itself had dimmed. It wasn't until late afternoon that Nia finally saw him. Taehyun emerged from his room like a ghost, his movements stiff, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. He looked different, thin, pale, as if he hadn't slept in days. His once bright eyes were sunken, the life behind them gone. He passed by Nia without a word, his gaze fixed on the floor as he walked, like a sufferer carrying the burden of something he couldn't name. Nia wanted to speak, to ask him if he was okay, to ask why he had been avoiding her, but the words stuck in her throat. What was the point? He was beyond her reach now, a person she could no longer connect with. His silence was deafening. Days blurred into one another. Nia tried her best to carry on, to focus on the work in the house, to keep herself busy so that she wouldn't have to think about Taehyun's isolation. But it was impossible. Every corner of the house felt empty without him, the spaces they used to share now vacant, like ghosts of happier times. Taehyun no longer came to the garden, where they used to meet in the mornings. Nia hadn't seen him there in days. The place that had once been a sanctuary for them both was now abandoned, its beauty lost in the absence of the one person who had brought it to life. Nia would sit there sometimes, alone, her thoughts a mess. The birds chirped in the distance, the wind ruffled the leaves of the trees, but none of it seemed to matter without him. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and she looked up to find Hana walking towards her, a quiet smile on her face. Nia, she greeted, her voice sweet but laced with an underlying tension. I thought you might be out here. Taehyun isn't coming out much lately, is he? Nia didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on the empty garden, the distant sound of a bird taking flight echoing in the silence between them. I'm worried about him, Hana continued, her voice softer now. He's been distant lately, more than usual. I'm sure it's because of everything that's been happening. Nia clenched her fists at her sides, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm sure he's fine," she said quietly, her words more of a lie than she cared to admit. But Hana's eyes narrowed, and she tilted her head slightly, watching Nia carefully. "You don't think it's because of you, do you?" she asked, her tone suddenly sharper. Nia's heart skipped a beat, but she swallowed hard, refusing to let herself show the hurt Hana's words had caused. "It's not my place to know," Nia replied, her voice steadied despite the tremor in her heart. Hana's expression softened, a knowing look crossing her face. "Of course, I understand. But you must know, Nia," she said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I'm the one who's meant to be with him. Not you." Nia just stared. She didn't quite have the interest to keep the talk going with Hana, so she just ignored. Taehyun's descent into isolation continued for another few days. Each day, he seemed to fade further and further from the world around him. He wouldn't talk to anyone, not even Hana, who had tried so hard to push herself into his life. She had stopped coming to him with the same persistence, though, sensing that her efforts were in vain. But one evening, when the sky outside had turned a soft lavender and the first stars began to twinkle, Taehyun emerged from his room again. This time, he didn't pass Nia without a glance. Instead, he stopped in front of her, his eyes empty, tired, as if he had given up on everything. "Nia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Nia looked up at him, her heart racing. She could barely look him in the eye, the weight of their silence too much to bear. "Taehyun," she breathed, her voice soft. He swallowed, a faint flicker of something, regret, longing, flashing in his eyes. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how to fix this, how to fix me." Tears pricked Nia's eyes as she reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against his. The moment their skin touched, it felt like electricity, like everything that had been broken was suddenly right again. But before she could say anything, Minjun appeared at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "Are you two finished with the drama?" he asked, his voice cold, though his eyes lingered on Nia a little too long. Taehyun pulled back immediately, stepping away from Nia as if to put distance between them. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "I'm just not myself lately." Minjun's gaze softened, but only for a moment, before he turned and walked away. Taehyun, still haunted by his own emotions, didn't seem to notice. His eyes never left Nia, and in that silence, it was clear that the unspoken words between them were more than both of them could handle. Nia stood there, her heart broken, her mind confused. Taehyun had reached out, but before she could respond, everything slipped away. His words, his gaze, they were enough to tear her apart. She had been waiting for him to open up, but now, it seemed like he was slipping further away, and no matter how much she tried, she couldn't reach him. And so, they stood there, trapped in their own worlds of unspoken words and silent pain, both of them wishing for a way out, but neither of them able to find it. The space between them had grown too wide, too deep, and the hearts they had once shared had begun to drift further apart. Would they ever find their way back? Or would the silence be their final separation? The questions lingered, unanswered, hanging heavy in the air, as the night sky darkened around them. It was early one morning when Nia decided to take a walk through the garden again. The air was crisp, the sky still painted in shades of blue and pink as the sun began to rise. She hadn't been here in days. It felt like the only place left where she could breathe, where the weight of everything didn't feel so heavy. She wandered slowly, taking in the peaceful surroundings. The flowers, the trees, the soft rustling of the leaves, everything felt familiar, but it was also tinged with the bittersweet memory of the times she and Taehyun had spent here. The garden had always been their place, where they shared their dreams, their laughter, their secrets, a place where she enjoyed every one of Taehyun's teasing. But now, it was just a place of memories. She sat down on the same stone bench they had once shared, pulling her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, as she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat when she saw him standing there, looking at her from a distance. Taehyun. His hair was messy, his face still tired from the restless nights he'd spent. But his eyes were softer, more vulnerable, as they locked with hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with all the things left unsaid, but there was something different now. The silence wasn't as heavy. It was like a promise, unspoken but understood. He took a step forward, and Nia couldn't help but hold her breath. Every muscle in her body seemed to freeze in anticipation, as though waiting for him to make the next move. Nia, he finally said, his voice hoarse, as if it had been too long since he last spoke. I don't know how to fix this, Taehyun said quietly, his gaze never leaving the ground. I've been lost. I've been so lost without you. And everything just seems to be crashing down more and more. His words were so raw, so unguarded, that they struck her like a lightning bolt. Nia's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't know how to respond. All this time, she had been waiting for him to open up, but now that she was afraid. Afraid of what he might say, afraid of what it might mean. I didn't know how to handle everything, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to deal with you being distant, and Hana. He exhaled deeply and continued. I don't know what's happening to me, Nia. You've always been there for me, and now it feels like I'm losing you. I don't feel you so close as before anymore. He said with voice slightly breaking as he sniffed as if to hold back something, tears maybe. Nia's breath hitched. Taehyun, she began, but he stopped her. His hand reaching for hers. His touch was gentle, tentative, as though he feared she would pull away. But Nia didn't pull away. Instead, she let him hold her hand, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt through her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this simple touch until now. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice breaking slightly. I've been a fool. I should have never let things get this way. Tears welled up in Nia's eyes as she looked at him. He looked down, his expression pained. I pushed you away without giving us a chance for a proper understanding. I should have trusted you. I should have trusted us, Nia. I'm sorry too, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't take the time to hear you out. I didn't know what to do. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the words between them settling like a gentle breeze. Then, slowly, Taehyun leaned forward, his lips brushing against her forehead in the softest of kisses. Nia's heart soared. It was a kiss full of longing, full of all the things they had both kept hidden. She closed her eyes, letting herself be swept away by the tenderness of the moment. It felt like coming home. As the days passed, things between them began to change. The distance that had once seemed so vast between them slowly closed, piece by piece. Taehyun was no longer the withdrawn, isolated version of himself he had been. He came to her, spoke to her, and when things grew difficult, they faced them together. They spent more time in the garden, where they had once shared so many special moments. There was still a lingering sadness, but it was slowly replaced by hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. The moments they shared were simple but meaningful. Sometimes, they would sit side by side in silence, simply enjoying the presence of the other. Other times, they would talk for hours, their laughter filling the air like music. And in the quiet moments, when their hands would brush, or their eyes would meet, Nia couldn't help but smile. There was still so much to work through, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe love wasn't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough. And as the sun set on another day in the garden, Nia knew one thing for sure: no matter how long it took, she and Taehyun would find their way back to each other. For their love, after all, was never truly lost. The days continued to drift by like a gentle breeze, but something felt different. Nia couldn't quite place her finger on it, but every time she looked at Taehyun, there was a deep, invisible wall between them. She missed the carefree moments, the playful banter, the easy laughter they shared. Now, every time they locked eyes, there was something unspoken, something that felt too heavy for words. He had begun to isolate himself more, retreating into his own world. The door to his room was often closed, and when it was open, he barely spoke. When he did come out, his movements were slower, more deliberate. There was a certain weariness about him that didn't go unnoticed by Nia. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she didn't know how to ask him. Every time she tried to get closer, he pulled away, as if trying to protect her from something. It hurt, but she couldn't blame him. She knew he was going through something, and she didn't want to force him to open up if he wasn't ready. Later, that night, Nia was about to retire to her own room after she had wrapped up with everything she needed to, when she heard a faint cough from down the hallway. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her stop in her tracks. Taehyun, she whispered, but there was no answer. Curious, she quietly walked toward his room. She didn't want to disturb him, but something told her that she needed to check on him. As she reached his door, she hesitated, unsure of whether she should knock or just leave him be. Before she could make up her mind, she heard another cough. This time, it was louder, more forceful. The sound made her heart skip a beat. It didn't sound normal. Without thinking, she gently pushed the door open, her heart racing in her chest. Taehyun was standing near the window, looking out at the night sky, his back to her. He didn't seem to notice her presence at first. Taehyun, Nia called softly, stepping into the room. He turned, but there was something in his expression that sent a chill down her spine. His face was pale, his lips a little too dry, and his eyes were tired, like he hadn't slept in days. "Are you okay?" Nia asked gently, her concern growing. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and walked over to the bed, sitting down with his head in his hands. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "I just need some rest." But Nia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't press him for answers. Instead, she walked over to the bed and sat beside him, her hand gently brushing against his. For a moment, they sat in silence, the tension between them palpable. Then, out of nowhere, Taehyun let out another violent cough, and this time, Nia saw it. There was a faint smear of blood on the back of his hand. Nia's heart stopped. Her eyes brightened in shock. She had seen it, but Taehyun quickly wiped it away, as if nothing had happened. "Taehyun," Nia whispered, her voice cracking. "What's going on? You're not fine. What's happening to you?" But he didn't answer her. Instead, he stood up abruptly and walked toward the bathroom. "I'm fine," he repeated, his voice distant, as if trying to convince himself. Just go back to your room, Nia. It's late." She watched him walk away, helpless, not knowing what to do. She wanted to push him, to demand that he tell her the truth, but she didn't. Not yet. She could tell he was fighting something internal, something he didn't want her to see, and maybe, just maybe, if she gave him time, he would eventually open up. But as she left the room, her heart ached with the knowledge that Taehyun was going through something she couldn't protect him from. At every passing of the day, Taehyun's solitude grew more pronounced. He spent long hours locked in his room, avoiding everyone. He didn't want to face his family, especially Nia. Even when she tried to break through the barrier he had built around himself, he couldn't let her in, not yet. One afternoon, Nia decided to take a walk in the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. She had noticed the distance growing between her and Taehyun. He had become so withdrawn, and she couldn't stand seeing him like that. It wasn't the boy she had grown so close to, the boy who used to make her laugh with his jokes and share his hopes and dreams. As she wandered, lost in thought, she found herself at the corner of the garden where they used to spend time together. The place was empty now, the flowers blooming around her, their fragrance sweet and comforting. Nia sat on the stone bench, wondering what had changed. Wondering why things felt so different. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. Nia turned to find Taehyun walking toward her. He was walking slowly, almost as if he was hesitant. There was something in his eyes that made her heart ache, an unreadable look, one that she had never seen before. Taehyun, she called softly. He didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at her. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he took a few tentative steps forward and sat beside her. He was silent, his body language closed off, but she could sense the unease radiating from him. "Why haven't you been coming out lately?" Nia asked, her voice gentle, laced with concern. "I miss seeing you." Taehyun's eyes flickered to the ground, as if he was searching for the right words. But no matter how much he wanted to say, no words came. The ache in his chest tightened. It was becoming harder to keep up the facade. "I've just been tired," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. Nia didn't buy it. She could tell there was more to it, so much more that he wasn't saying. Instead, she placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm and comforting. "I'm here, Taehyun," she whispered, her voice soft. "Whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone." His heart skipped a beat at her words. He wanted to tell her everything, about the pain he was hiding, the coughing fits that left him breathless, the fear that gnawed at him when he thought about the future. But he couldn't. He couldn't burden her with his illness. He didn't want her to look at him the way he saw himself, a broken version of the person he once was. But Nia was persistent. She squeezed his arm gently, urging him to speak. Her voice was full of sincerity and concern, and he could see the genuine care in her eyes. She wasn't going to let him shut her out. He swallowed hard, fighting against the tightness in his chest. But instead of pushing her away, he leaned into her touch, just for a moment. It felt good to feel her warmth, to feel her presence. It was the only thing that made him forget, even if only briefly, the weight that pressed on him every day. "I'm not okay," he finally confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want you to worry. I'll be fine. I just need some time." "I'm here, Taehyun," she said again, her voice steady. "Whenever you're ready to talk, I'll be right here." For the first time in weeks, Taehyun allowed himself to relax, even just a little. The tension in his chest seemed to ease, just a fraction, as he sat there beside her, resting his head slightly on her available shoulder. He didn't speak, but the silence between them wasn't awkward, it was filled with understanding. Later that night, as Taehyun was getting ready for bed, he could feel the familiar tightness in his chest again. His breath hitched as he walked toward the bathroom, and before he could stop it, he coughed, harsh and deep. He felt a sharp pain in his throat. And when he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his fingers came away stained with blood. He froze. The blood was brighter than he had expected. A sickening realization settled over him as he stared at his hand, his heart hammering in his chest. No. Not now. Not like this. He quickly rinsed his mouth, wiping the blood away before anyone could notice. He knew he couldn't let anyone see, especially Nia. He didn't want her to worry, didn't want to drag her into this darkness with him. So he hid it, locking the door to his bathroom and sitting on the edge of the tub, trying to steady his breath. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time felt like it had stopped. But as the dizziness started to fade, he finally pulled himself together and left the bathroom, determined not to let anyone know. The next day, things were tense. Taehyun was quieter than usual, even more withdrawn. Nia couldn't understand it. She thought they had made some progress, that they were finally starting to heal the distance that had grown between them. But now it felt like she was losing him all over again. As the day went on, Nia found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the garden. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. What had happened to the boy she had come to care for so deeply? Why was he pushing her away? And, more than anything, why did it feel like there was a wall she could never break down? One evening, everything changed. Taehyun had asked to meet her in the garden, the same place where they had shared laughter, quiet confessions, and stolen moments that made her heart race. She had hurried to him, feeling an anxious flutter in her chest, hoping, praying, that this was the moment things would finally return to how they used to be. But as she reached him, standing beneath the wisteria tree with his hands buried in his pockets, she felt something was off. He wasn't smiling. His usual warm eyes were clouded with something unreadable. His posture was stiff, his shoulders tense. Something about him felt distant. Nia hesitated before stepping closer. "You wanted to talk." Her voice was gentle, hopeful. Taehyun turned to her, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary, as if memorizing every detail. Then, after a deep breath, he spoke. "Stop loving me, Nia." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Nia's smile faltered, her heart hammering violently in her chest. What? "I mean it," Taehyun said. "Stop loving me. Put all that love on Minjun instead. He's the better choice. He's stronger, more stable, he's the one who deserves you. Who deserves your love. More than I do." For a moment, there was only silence. The kind of silence that suffocates, that drains all the warmth from the air. Then, Nia laughed, softly, disbelievingly. It wasn't out of amusement, but out of sheer heartbreak. "How can you say that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can you ask me to love someone else when it's you my heart belongs to?" Taehyun refused to meet her gaze. His hands gripped the fabric of his shirt so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Because I'm not worth it." His voice was barely above a whisper. Nia's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. "Not worth it," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "So you think love is about worth? You think I chose to love you because you were perfect? Taehyun, I love you for you, every piece of you. Even the broken parts. I saw Minjun, but I still chose you, Taehyun." A sharp breath left his lips as if her words had struck him in the chest. "But I don't want to hurt you." Tears welled in Nia's eyes, burning, threatening to fall. "Then why are you doing exactly that right now? You're asking me to stop loving you as if it's something I can turn off. As if all our moments meant nothing. Is this really what you want, Taehyun? For me to love your brother instead? For me to pretend that what we have, what we feel, the love we've shared, isn't real?" Taehyun squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body tense. Yes. The single word shattered something inside Nia. A tear escaped, rolling down her cheek as she let out a shaky breath. "You're a liar," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying to me, and you're lying to yourself." Taehyun remained silent, his expression unreadable. Then, just as he opened his mouth to say something else, he suddenly clutched his chest, gripping it very tightly. It was pain, a very sharp, unbearable pain tore through him, worse than anything he had ever felt before. His legs buckled beneath him, and before he could stop himself, he collapsed onto the ground. "Taehyun!" Nia cried out in alarm, rushing to his side. He was breathing heavily, his entire body shaking as he groaned deeply. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced before. His vision blurred, his head pounding. "I'm fine," he gritted out, trying to push himself up, but he was still in pain. But his arms were weak, trembling under his weight. Nia reached out to help him, panic clear in her eyes, but he jerked away from her touch. "Don't," he gasped. "Just go. Please, Nia, just go." Her heart ached at the sight of him suffering, his usual strong form crumbling right before her eyes. "No, I'm not leaving you like this," she protested, trying again to reach for him. "Taehyun, tell me what's wrong." But he only shook his head, his breathing ragged, his fingers digging into the grass beneath him as if grounding himself was the only thing keeping him conscious. Nia could feel the tears streaming down her face, but she didn't care. She was terrified because something was seriously wrong, and he was still pushing her away. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Just let me help you." Taehyun finally forced himself to sit up, though the pain was still radiating through him. He glanced at her, and for the first time, she saw it. The fear in his eyes. It wasn't just fear of the pain. It was fear of losing her. But instead of saying anything, instead of reaching for her the way she so desperately wanted him to, he turned away. "Go, Nia," he whispered. "Before I make this harder for both of us." And that was when Nia's heart shattered completely. With one final, broken glance at him, she stood up, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. She wanted to stay. She wanted to fight. But how could she fight for someone who wouldn't let her? As she slowly walked away, her footsteps fading into the night, Taehyun let out a slow, pained breath. He pressed a shaking hand against his chest, feeling the dull ache settle beneath his ribs. And for the first time since falling in love with Nia, he wondered if letting her go was the biggest mistake of his life. To be continued. This story is not yet ended. More mysteries unravel in the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe our channel if you love this story and want to continue it. See you soon.